Hi, this is Carson with Troy, and I have with me Austin Colton. Austin is an author and an artist. He has released two books so far and a short story, which you can get free on his website. The books are Child of Fire and Child of Rot. Child of Fire came out in 2021. Child of Rot came out earlier this year, from my understanding, from what I saw in research. Is that correct?
Yeah, book two came out in June, and book three is on its way.
Perfect. Now I'm going to read about Austin from his website, I just love this. So, as a jack of all trades and a master of none, he compulsively takes on far too many projects at once. He has found this is a good strategy for curing perpetual boredom and a head stuck in the clouds. So we'll stop there. It goes on to say where you live, but um, tell me about these projects you do that you take on a little bit too much of.
So I don't know. I just love all things entertainment, right? So growing up, I played music, I drew, I wrote. So I like to do a little bit of everything. I like to have multiple creative projects going on at once, and that helps me out a lot because sometimes you get stuck on something, especially writing. People know about writer's block. You're not quite sure where to go. Sometimes it's fun to open up something else that you can be creative in, pivot, and then you just in the back of your mind you're kind of working through the other idea, and you can kind of jump around. So you know, uh, I like to start a whole bunch of things, and it takes a lot of work for me to sit down and finish things, which is why I think early as an author, it took a long time to get something done and published. But I got wonderful advice that's like, okay, you got to finish things. But I found that it's easier to finish things if I have a couple things going at once, just so that way, if I feel burned out, I don't not make progress for a couple of days because I'm always working and progressing somewhere. So that's
That's that's fantastic, and that was a little tangent. Normally I don't, read people's bios from their website and ask that question, but I thought that was a good gold nugget. I know lots of people, we have the conscious and the subconscious mind, and lots of times, like, we'll get ideas when we're not consciously thinking about a particular project, like if we're showering or shaving or doing whatever, and those ideas come. So that's great advice for people who are struggling finishing a project, finishing a book, finishing a piece of art, is to start something else, but your subconscious will always have that in the back of your mind, and inspiration comes very
yeah,
when I'd say occasionally, but it comes pretty often.
yeah. That has been my experience. Like I've read in a few places that like Ernest Hemingway like put everything he had into his novel, and then after he finished he always like became super depressed,
Mm.
and it took him a while to get started on the next project. So part of the advice that I was given is it's like, okay, when you're kind of rounding out one project, finishing it up, get started on the next project. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, okay, it's like I noticed that different parts of the process, whether it's writing or editing, it takes different parts of the brain to do one or the other. So you can make more progress by doing a little bit of a few things. But yeah, it was I can't remember exactly in which interview. I watched one with Neil Gaiman, and he basically said, finish things. So whatever you start writing, it's like at least get to the end. And so, I mean, that's my method for getting to the end, because you always get stuck somewhere. So it's helpful to you know grease the wheels, I guess, or have something else going on that can distract you while you're working through the snags.
That's great advice. Now let's move on to you, Austin. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about you and about your two books. The series I forgot to mention is called The Ballad of Sorrows. So go ahead and tell us about The Ballad of Sorrows and the two books.
Yeah, so it's I've been writing for the better part of 11 years now. I started my first novel when I was in high school. I didn't finish. I got about a third of the way through. And then in 2016, October of 2016, I started writing the first novel that I would have gone on to finish, but I haven't published. A lot of authors may or may not have written several books that weren't very good at the very beginning. So that was kind of how I was for a few years. I wrote a couple of books. They weren't super great. I wasn't good at editing or doing multiple drafts. I would just finish draft one and was dissatisfied. I'd set it aside. And then I spent a couple of years bouncing between projects where I'd get maybe a third of the way into a story, and then I'd get stuck and I'd have an idea for another story. So I'd start that other story. I did that for a couple of years, and I ended up with a whole bunch of unfinished stories. And I'm like, okay, I got to finish something. And that's when I took one of those unfinished ideas, and I was like, okay, what can I do with this? This is the one that I'm going to finish, and that ended up becoming Child of Fire. So it took a couple of years from when I first started the first book that I published to actually finishing it. So the concept, like at the time, I was reading a lot of Jim Butcher, who's most well known for the Dresden Files, and I love those detective murder mystery stories. And I was also getting really into the James Bond movies at the time, and I'm like, I love that serialization where you kind of have the big bad and the monster, and they're sort of vanquished, and it kind of takes place in, at least with the Dresden Files, in Chicago. So it's a city, and I'm like, okay, how could I take something like this and put it in an epic fantasy setting? So that whole concept sort of evolved into, it's like, okay, I'm taking a James Bond-esque character and I'm setting him in the world of The Witcher. And that evolved from there, from that initial idea into what became Child of Fire. I published that in May of 2021. I decided to go the self-publishing route, and I designed the first version of the cover myself, kind of did the interior formatting and released it, and then didn't really do too much for about a year. I was still going to school, and a lot of things were going on with shifting in work. And about a little more than a year ago, I was connected with an editor, and I was like, okay, I want to go through my original book, because I knew that it's always challenging to make sure there are no grammatical mistakes or any typos. And I'm like, okay, I want to get a new cover designed, a new interior designed, and turn my indie book into, present it more professionally, especially with, I wanted to start marketing it. So I did sort of a rebrand for Child of Fire. That rebrand was finished last November. And then during that time, I've been working on book two, which I published back in June. And then I'm currently going through the editing and sort of the post stuff for creating the cover and getting everything ready for book three. So it's kind of been the journey over the last couple of years. As
So
far
you had
as
these unfinished novels. What was it about Child of Fire that you're like, okay, this is the one I want to pursue?
It's a good question. I think of all of the stories, I think it was the smallest in scope. The first one that I wrote is definitely more of an epic, with a bunch of viewpoint characters, and at starting off, it's like balancing a whole bunch of different stories and intertwining them. I was like, okay, this is a good story, but I'm not currently there as far as a writer to balance the scale of what I'm trying to do. And Child of Fire is one character. It's written in first person, and it was sort of a standalone story where I was like, okay, I can do this adventure. I can set up a character, and I can do these sort of James Bond style movies where it's like it's the same characters and there is a through line, and things carry over, but each one is its own adventure. And because it was a little bit more manageable, the scope wasn't as big. I was like, okay, this is something that it's like I got to finish it. And then when I did finish it, I was like, I was happy with it. I was like, okay, this is good. This is probably the best thing I've ever written. It needs work. I need to revise this. So it's the first time I'd ever finished a full draft and then decided, okay, I'm going to do a second draft, and went through that process. So that, I think that's why I chose it, is just it was a smaller, more contained story that I felt like at the time I'm capable of, and then I was very happy with the result.
Now, are you when you were writing this, were you a free writer or did you have an outline? What was your writing process?
For these books, I write into the dark. I don't do any outlines. A lot of people call it like gardening,
Guardian
like George R. R.
architect?
Martin or Stephen King. There's a lot of terms for it. My favorite is writing into the dark, which was coined by Dean Wesley Smith. And it's basically you have a character, you a setting in mind, and a conflict, and you basically just plop your character down into the setting and just see where it goes. My process it requires a lot more work on the back end. So once you finish a draft, I found that I have to do some pretty heavy revisions for draft two, because you come up with ideas, and by the end, it's like you're like, okay, I see where I want it to go. So you have to shore things up. Sometimes I have to delete sections that just don't really contribute to the main story. And there are sometimes I have to go and rewrite and add characters to support my character. But that process has worked really well for me. But I've also experimented with creating other outlines. But a lot of what I do is more the world building. So I'm building. It's like, okay, who is the character? What do they look like? Building information about the setting. So that way I have it's like basically collecting all the different paint colors that you're going to use and then getting all of that ready so that way I can pull from all that information when I'm writing rather than building a blueprint for where it's going. But I've been experimenting with doing a little bit more outlining, and just trying new bits of the process. And I found that it's definitely helped cut back on the editing of my newest novel. And I found I did do a little bit more outlining for book three because I was like, okay, I want to end the story. So I had to, I guess with the sequels, I've had to do a little bit more outlining because you leave plot threads that are like, okay, I need to make sure that this gets done. So I'm not necessarily planning when or how it's going to happen, only just kind of making a list of, hey, you need to make sure that um, you hit these plot points, like that
Hmm.
these things get covered. And my process has evolved, but I still just there's something about taking a character, throwing them in a setting, and just seeing where it goes that I enjoy that part of the process the most. And it's less you're not trying to focus on having a whole novel in your head. You're just thinking about the next scene and how you're going to bring that to life. So
Now, speaking of evolving, you have taken classes and tried to improve your writing by some of the greats. Do you want to go into detail on that and tell us who you were taught by?
yeah, so the first time I ever went to a writing conference, it's called FireCon. It's up near. It was held at Weber University up in northern Utah, and I took a sort of a 4-day course by David Farland. David Farland is, very famous for writing The Rune Lords, but he's worked on a lot of other projects, and he used to teach at BYU. He's famously the teacher of like Brandon Sanderson, Brandon Knoll, Stephanie Meyer, James Dashner. So many of basically from the last 20 years, a lot of those emerging writers in fantasy, were instructed by Dave. So I took his class, and it was very, very informative. I learned so much from him, and that it was actually after taking his class that I decided, okay, I need to. That's when I decided that Child of the Fire. It's like, okay, I'm starting this and I'm finishing this. So I took a lot of what he taught me in order to finish that. Um, then about a couple years later, or about a year and a half later, my friend who was attending BYU signed up for Sanderson's class, and I didn't go to BYU, but he's just like, hey, you should just come with me. And it's an auditorium style class, so there's no role, like they pass around a sheet of paper. So I just came to campus, met up with him. It's kind of late in the evening, so we'd grab dinner. We'd walk over to the building, and I took Brandon's class, unenrolled, and nobody noticed. Um, but yeah, that was great as well. Like I'd seen his lectures on YouTube, but it was interesting to be there. Um, he definitely had refined the material since the previous recordings that I had seen, and it sort of shored up a lot of the things that I was currently working on. And after that class was over, that was that May in 2021 when or I guess it was a year after that because I took it in 2020 that semester. So the year later is when I ended up publishing my book. But I've taken a lot of online courses like the master class from Neil Gaiman. David Farland does a lot of online stuff as well. So I've watched a lot of those videos, and I've read a lot of books trying to just absorb information and advice. And one of the best things that I ever read was there's no right way. Um, and so you take what's useful and you leave the rest, but not to judge any of the like prejudge the advice. So sometimes you get advice that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, or it's a someone else's process that maybe it's very different than your own, and to just kind of absorb those ideas and to try them out. Um, and that's helped me a lot. Like growing and trying to become better as a writer. I just feel like after every book, it's like, okay, it's like I'm proud of what I did, but how can I become better? How can I make my sentences better? Or how can I improve my stories? How can I write short stories? Or how can I balance multiple viewpoints? And so I found that, trying out different things and not being just, oh, this is the way I've done it before, this is how I have to do it, and being open to that, that's helped me grow, especially over the last year. Like I've written more consistently over the last year and a half than I think I have in the previous 10 years of writing, and that's made a big difference.
Well, let's go into that. What are some of your habits so you stay consistent?
So there's a really good book. It's a business book called Essentialism by Greg McEwen.
Okay.
It's more tailored towards business, but I found that the business books, it's really interesting to take those principles and apply that to being a professional writer. And it's by taking that professional mindset that, that's what separates professionals from amateurs. It's not really the success or the, money or fame or any of that. Like that comes or it doesn't. But if you want to be a professional and you treat yourself as a professional, I found that those books can be helpful. But he made a really interesting observation, and basically he said that if you set a daily minimum and a daily maximum for yourself, it ensures that you make gradual progress every day rather than burning yourself out or not making any progress. So the story behind it was during the first Antarctic expeditions where they were trying to get to the South Pole, there were two teams that went out, and the team that was successful, basically, they're like, okay, we're not going to go more than 15 miles a day, but we're not going to go less than 5 miles a day. And they were overly prepared. They had more food than they needed, more of basically every type of supply that they needed. And on the harsh winter days, it's like, even though 5 miles is much less than 15, they were still making progress. And on the good days, they didn't tire themselves out by stretching beyond their limits. And so if you apply that to business, it's like, okay, on the worst day where you're just not feeling it, it's like, okay, what is the minimum that you can do? And it's still a stretch, but it's like, what is that minimum? And then what's the maximum, where on the best day, don't burn yourself out by going overboard, because a lot of the times if you do have that energy, it carries out. So for me, I set that as 500 words a day as my daily minimum, which realistically I can do within 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes 25, depending on if I'm struggling. And then no more than 3,500. And that way it's like, and then I found that every day I ended up creating a spreadsheet. I put in the date, I put in my starting word count, my finishing word count, and the total words for the day, and it keeps me accountable. And so every day I look at that and I'm like, okay, well, I got to get those 500 words done. And anyone who writes knows that there are some days where it's hard to get out a sentence. But I found that it's like, okay, 20 minutes, just buckle down and get something, and not worrying about whether it's good or not. But that daily consistency has made a huge difference, because before I would maybe write a couple thousand words and then it'd be a week, maybe two, and then I hadn't written anything. And I'm like, why is it taking so long to write this book? It's like, well, you're not working on it every day. And at least that's worked for me. And it's helped me out a lot. And it keeps me from burning out, because sometimes, you're really feeling it and you just keep writing and keep writing. But I find that those days, like, I write all this stuff and then the next day is super hard, because I'm like, oh, I wrote so much yesterday. Now I can't even, like, I don't know where to go, or
Right.
it's hard to trudge again. And so that was, you know, an unusual place to find amazing writing advice. And it's really worked for me.
That's actually a like a super gold nugget that you just laid down. Like having a minimum and a maximum. Like people will have goals, right? But they'll just be like, okay, I want to write 1,000 words a day. And when they don't get that, they feel like a failure. And when they see that, like they're joyful, but it's not every day that they'll reach their goal, and so they feel like a failure. I like that. Set a minimum and set a maximum. And while you were talking, I did a quick calculation, and I've said this before, but I've never given an exact number. If you wrote 250 words a day as your minimum, if you set that, it's 91,250 words in a year.
Mhm.
So I don't know how long. I mean, you said it takes anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes to write 500 words, so 250 words might be 10-15 minutes. That's
Mhm.
about my speed as well. I can find 10 minutes a day. Everybody can find 10 minutes a day, to do something, even if it's 100 words. Like, if you want to write a book, um setting a minimum and a maximum is a really good idea to do, and that was fantastic. That was worth the interview right there. So thanks for that.
Thanks. No, that it's just made the biggest difference, because you're right. It's like I used to set 2,000 words a day. And I would do that, but then it gets hard, and maybe you have an off day and you don't reach that and you kind of feel like a failure. But making that minimum, it's attainable even on your hardest day. It's still a stretch. Like, it's not 10 words or 50, but whatever your minimum is. But you find your writing speed. And yeah, if you do, as you said, 250 words a day, and you spend 10-15 minutes a day, you'll write a book a year. You'll get to about the 80,000 words. And there's are authors that make a living publishing a book a year. Traditionally published authors, it's very common that they have a book come out every year. And so it's also thinking, it's like, okay, if I can fit that 10-15 minutes in to reach my daily minimum, it's like, can I find a little bit more time, maybe do twice as much? And not putting too much pressure on yourself, because you are going to have those off days. But it feels good to reach that minimum. And once I hit that minimum for the day, everything else that I write for that day just feels like gravy. It's just, oh, I got a little bit even more done than that.
Right.
And
Well,
it,
and
and
lots
it
of
feels
times,
good, you know?
it's like physics, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. And so like usually when you start and you don't want to, it might feel like going through mud, but after a while, like things just kind of start snowballing, and pretty soon you're up to 500 words or 1,000 words, and you're like, oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, exactly. The object in motion stays in motion. That's a great way to describe it. And with any habit, whether it's going to the gym or reading or whatever you're trying to do, it's now become, for me, if like the thought of not writing 500 words, like sometimes I'll get to like 250 and I'm like, Austin, you can do 250 more. You can get this. You can do it. But it's really fun. And the reason I track it in a spreadsheet is it's that visible representation that's holding me accountable. And
Right.
it's really cool to see that day over day progress and that word count increase. And I can see it's like I'm getting there, because you don't write a book all at once. You write it, piece by piece. But that's
No,
made a
and to
big
stay
difference.
consistent, I like your spreadsheet. And that's kind of what I do as well. And Tools for Titans by Tim Ferriss. He talks about I think he interviewed Jerry Seinfeld, or just had an example of Jerry Seinfeld, where Jerry puts a red X on the calendar each day he writes a joke. And his goal is no, don't break the chain, like don't break the red X chain. And
Mhm.
that's another way that people can do, like, okay, if they don't want to track it through a spreadsheet, they can put up a calendar right where they write and make an X, or do something on their phone, or what, some sort of visual representation to help hold them accountable, like you said. So that's a great advice as well. So you said you found an editor. How did you go about finding an editor to make your book what it was? And then you said you changed the cover, so you found an artist to do that as well.
Yes. So with that side of things, how I got my editor is kind of unique. I have a really good writer friend, the same friend that dragged me to the Brandon Sanderson class. He works for Dabble. Dabble's a software for writers. So he's basically their lead marketing guy, and he works with quite a few editors. They publish a lot of content on their blog that's designed to help writers, get better or get the story out that they're trying to tell. Anyway, I told him, hey, I'm looking for an editor. And he's like, hey, you should work with this guy. He does work for my company. So he got us connected through that. But um, so he went through and he did sort of line editing. So it's not really the developmental editing where it's like trying to help you through your story. It was just more of shoring up the grammar and being like, hey, um, let's make this capitalization or this naming sequence consistent. Things that like I would have never really picked up on. I'm not the biggest grammar person. I just kind of read for the enjoyment of reading. And but I know that there are some people where that can be distracting, and I wanted the book to be as good as I could possibly make it. So my editor just helps me with that. Just helps me with the line editing. Um, maybe if I repeat a word too frequently in the same paragraph, he's like, "Hey, maybe you're using this word too much. Um, here's how you can improve that description or that flow." So during the developmental process, I actually will have a beta reader that'll just kind of help me with the story. If things basically, if something worked or didn't work, just that kind of feedback, and I can work through it that way. So that's how I found my editor. But um, there are other great ways of finding editors. I know people that have used LinkedIn to find editors, but the service that I found to be really good is also Reedsy. And that's the same service that I found my cover artists. So
Okay.
my editor, he told me about Reedsy. I logged in and I was like, okay, these covers look great. You can filter for your genre. I just filtered for fantasy. You submit to you can submit to 5 people at once, kind of the same query. It keeps it all private, and then they can get back to you with sort of quotes. I went with GS Cover Design Studio. So Gene and Sasha, they're based out of New York. They're one of the hybrid design studios. So they used to do a lot of things for traditional publishers. When the indie scene got big, they started working with indies as well. So that was one thing that really attracted me to them, is because I was like, okay, these are people that, I mean, they designed the covers for Brian McKellen's A Promise of Blood that series. And so I was like, okay, these, like, they've worked with the industry. They know, having that professional cover, it's like they know what the audience is expecting. Because when you go into a Barnes and Noble and you look at the books, it's like if you, I've gone through and I've taken tons of pictures, but the fantasy section, those are fantasy books. And of course, trends and things change, but you do want to make these books look as professional as possible. And one thing that I've noticed is the only people that there are a few people, but most people don't assume that you're indie when they see that professional book. A lot of the times, it draws their attention.
Right.
And so for me, it's like, okay, I'm just to be indie. I just wanted to treat myself as the publisher. That's the only difference. So instead of having the publisher take care of the editing, the copy editing, the formatting, and the cover design, and then the marketing, I'm going to just take all of that on. And so, I had to do a lot of learning, and I'm still learning a lot of those parts of the business. But that's how I got that was why I went with who I went for my covers. They did a fantastic job,
Yeah, they look amazing.
and it makes a big difference. And um, so yeah, it's that's how I got it. So again, the site's called Readsy. You can use services like Fiverr, but again, you do get what you pay for. And I'm a big believer that you know you have to invest as much into your book as a publisher would. If you wanted to really take it seriously. There are people that I know that it's just a hobby, and it's something that I love, but I'm like knowing things about the business. I'm a marketing guy. Um, I do work in marketing still, and kind of do writing. I do both. But if the goal is to go the indie route and to become a professional writer who's making a living through your writing, it's like you have to take on the publisher's responsibilities.
Right.
Um, and from what I've noticed and everybody that I've met in the community, those who do take on those responsibilities, I've seen so many amazing and successful people that they're living their dream. And that's the other thing is, you know the old methods of distribution, and gatekeepers, that's all coming down. You can build an audience, you can share your stories easier than you ever could. And it's I find that to be really, really cool, especially with writing. And I feel like we're getting stories that we would have never been able to get before, just because not because they weren't deserving or because they weren't good, but just the sheer amount of books that people write versus how many can be published by the traditional publishers a year. It's just not every book makes it that way.
Right.
But it's like those people want to read those books. There are great stories out there. So it's really cool to see that people you know, are doing that. And so that's part of why I went indie as well, is I just felt like it was the way that I could get my stories out there. So,
Right. And one thing that I didn't realize before I started interviewing is how much publishers controlled what left their publishing houses and what entered the market. I mean, I remember talking to somebody and they were like, yeah, we received a submission and it was probably like one of the best stories I've ever read, but we weren't looking for that type of story. We were looking for this type of story. So we just had to deny him and send the thing back, which for an aspiring author can be very demoralizing and very I don't know, have that feeling of wanting to give up because and it could be just a simple decision as we're just not doing that story right now. So like the indie route, being able to have those, like you said, gatekeepers down and be able to get your book out there, um, it's a way that you can find an audience that wants that type of story to where you can be successful and pretty much write any type of story you want. In a world of 8 billion people, um, you're kind of conceited to think that you won't find those people. You just have to, like you said, market and get the book out there. So let's talk about the marketing side. What have you found successful getting your book in readers' hands?
So far I published through Amazon. Um, I'm keeping my current series exclusive through KDP as well, and Kindle Unlimited. And I found that as a great way of, it lowers the cost of initial investment. I love used bookstores.
Me too.
The reason I love used bookstores is I can get really nice books. And I specifically like hardcovers. Hardcovers are expensive. Um, but I love going to used bookstores and picking up something that catches my attention, and I can get a really nice hardcover for $7, $12, about the same price as a mass market paperback.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'll pick up those books, and my initial level of investment is a lot lower. And then because I collect the hardcovers a lot of the times, so it's like, okay, the next couple books in the series, I'll buy them brand new when they come out. Um, and a lot of writing, and I guess a lot of readers and stories, word of mouth is huge. I picked up The Wheel of Time because I'd heard so many good things about it, and I knew somebody that read the whole thing, and they're like, "Oh, it's going to be a story for you." And so it's kind of a mix of that. And so back to Kindle Unlimited is, the people that use Kindle Unlimited, they love reading, and a lot of the times, if it's in their genre, it's something that they're interested in, they're reading all of the time. So it's a really low level of investment. It's just their time. Is it
Hmm.
something that they want to read? And so I've had a lot of reads through just Kindle Unlimited, and I didn't do my release strategy properly. I released book one with um, not the worst cover ever, but it was something that I did myself because I was too cheap and poor at the time to invest in a cover, and I didn't know what I was doing. Um, and I just formatted the book in Word. I The one thing I did right though is I got the size right. So it's 5.5 by 8. I went to my bookshelf and I'm like, okay, what is my favorite size of book? And I just kind of went through and I was looking at it and for paperbacks, and I'm like, I found one, and I'm like, okay. And I measured it, and I kind of like looked at the inner margins, and I'm like, okay. So, you know, I, that was the first thing that I did where I'm like learning how to produce a book. So if I were to do it again, I would have done the editing, proper formatting, the cover design, and released it. And then I would have immediately started on book two, if not started book two before.
Hmm.
But because I kind of had a year gap before I was able to start working on book two, um, it's like have had to kind of rebuild. So I did the rebranding. Since I've had book two out, that's helped a lot as well. And I anticipate that having book three out, it'll finish the series. You can market an omnibus or a 3-in-1 digital, and those tend to do really well. In the industry, at least in fantasy, you have the big names that maybe haven't finished their series, and it's made a lot of readers guarded of, okay, I'm not going to start anything unless it's finished.
Right.
Unless they have read things by the author that have been finished, and they've built up that trust and that relationship.
Hmm.
But when it comes to trying out new things, you have a certain demographic that's like, I'm not going to pick it up until it's finished.
Right.
So that I anticipate will help a lot. um, I've done Amazon ads. I've built my website, building an email list, and doing live events. The previous how we met was at FanX in Utah, so that was the first live event that I've gone to, but selling books to people in person. And that was an incredible experience. I was super nervous for, because you never know how it's going to go. And it was really cool to actually talk to people about my book, see them, see how their interest kind of changed from seeing the cover to hearing the pitch to reading the blurb, or even kind of reading the first few sentences, to them wanting and buying the book. And as a writer, I think the biggest thing is, at least for me, is I just want people to read the book, and to enjoy the story the same, and be inspired the way that the books that I have read have inspired me.
Hmm.
So those are all things that I've done. And there's no right way of doing things. I think every author's journey is going to be a little bit different. um, but there are some tried and true method or tactics that I think hold true, and that's just the packaging. I think the cover is probably the most important thing that you can invest in, um, and then getting it out there and then leaving it out there. I was reading a book by Dean Wesley Smith called the 10 Sacred Killing the 10 Sacred Cows of Indie Publishing.
Hmm.
And it talks about, like, when you release a book for the first time, you're not gonna have most people aren't gonna have an audience. They're probably gonna have a handful of friends and family that buy the book. And that's how it was for me, just kind of getting started, and a little by little, word of mouth, talking to more people. It's slowly snowballed from there. But it's like, if you don't hit these imagined sales figures, oh, you're a failure. It's like, I feel like a lot of people, they get nervous, or they pull their book down, and they're like, oh, it must not be good because it didn't hit some imagined sales figure, when really it does take time. And in that same book, Smith basically says the one of the best things that you can do for your writing and marketing is writing the next book.
Right.
And then, so you do all of the other things, but it's writing the next book and getting it out there, and leaving it up there, so that way people can discover it. Because I've met a lot of people that, you know they um they either did what I did, where they released it and maybe weren't quite ready, or they didn't have everything um prepared the way that they wanted to, and then they take it down, and they feel like they have to start over, and that can be really demoralizing.
Right.
And so the way I see it is, if you finish a book, you're success. That's a success.
Hmm.
I think I read a study once that 1 in 4 people, at least in the United States, where the survey was done, said that in their lifetime they wanted to write a book. That's hundreds of millions of people.
Right.
But of all of the people that say that they want to, only about 5% of those actually start. And then only 5% of those people ever finish.
Right.
So I think just finishing a book and having that's a huge accomplishment. And sometimes I've noticed, I mean, even myself, it's just like, you don't recognize the accomplishment for what it was. And I think that's important to just, you're a success just for being here,
Right.
being at the table. You don't have to sell like Stephen King to be successful. And another good example of this is, the lead singer of Megadeth was originally in Metallica.
Metallica. Yeah.
And
Dave
then
Mustaine.
yeah, and then he got kicked out, and he went back to LA. I think that's where he was living, super mad. And he's like, I'm going to start a new band, and we're going to be better than those guys. And Megadeth was enormously successful, but they were never more successful than Metallica. And Dave Mustaine said he felt like a failure for most of his career because they were never better than Metallica. And, this comparing yourself to somebody else is like, no one's journey is the same. Like on the reverse, one of the founding members of the Beatles, who Ringo replaced, got kicked out or left, and he ended up just working a normal job and was super happy and had a family.
Yeah.
And he never felt like he missed out because he left the Beatles. It's like, you know, so when I heard those two stories of just like, you know, you got to realize that every author's journey is going to be a little different, and to treat yourself as a professional and successful regardless of what stage you're at. As long as you just don't kill your dream.
Yeah.
If this is your dream, the only person who has the power to kill it is you. Just don't kill your dream. And regardless of what stumbling blocks or how difficult it is, you just press forward.
Well, I've been to Brandon Sanderson signings where there was like 20 people there. So like, everybody's a beginner. Everybody starts the same way. If you continue on and like you said, like produce the next book, and that will lead to more sales. Like if you keep pursuing your dream, lots of times you'll be successful. So that's great advice. Now at FedEx, where I met you, you were linked up with a bunch of different authors. I think there was 9 or 10 of you. Um,
Yeah, there are a lot of us. Yeah.
how did you get hooked up with them to be there with them?
So that's an interesting story. So I met Robert at a writing conference in Vegas. They do it every year. It's called 20 Books Vegas.
Story books
And
50K.
yeah, 20 Books to 50K runs it. And the whole idea is that, behind the 20 books to 50K is that if you have 20 books out there, each one is, selling $7 a day. You're basically making a sale or two on each of your books every day. You would be making a living, or you'd be making $50,000 as an author. And of course, there's people that are successful before that. But anyway, it's a really cool writing conference. I went to that last year, and I'll be attending again this year.
Me too.
But I met Robert. Um, I went because my cover artists, they told me about it, and they're like, hey, if you want to meet other indies and learn more about the publishing business, you should come to this. So actually, that's why I even went in the first place. I had never heard of it before, and I learned a lot of great things. I learned a lot of things about the industry. I learned the most though is one afternoon. I think it was the second day. I ran into my cover artists. They were chatting with a couple authors who, of course, happen to be fantasy authors. And that's when I met Robert Zangari. And I went to dinner with a whole bunch of these fantasy writers. And they run a Facebook group called IFA, or Indie Fantasy Addicts. And so I joined the Facebook group, and for the next 4 days, it was basically me and these group of authors. And we attended the panels together, but most of the time we just were chatting and talking about our writing styles, or I was just kind of learning about their careers and what they were doing. And just talking with other people and making those connections, that was probably the most beneficial thing. Like if I had gone to the conference and hadn't attended any of the panels, just the people that I met and being with other authors, that was incredible. So because I met Robert, we hit it off. We had a lot in common, and we kind of write the same style. He for the last few years has kind of put together these indie author booths at FanX. So he coordinated that for us. So I was just invited to participate, and it was a really cool way that a whole bunch of authors could get together. It's way more affordable for a bunch of us to pay a small price for part of a table rather than to try to rent out a whole booth by ourselves. And it also makes it a little less intimidating because you're there with other writers, and if you meet somebody that maybe your style of book isn't for them, you can just send them down to the next author who does. So that was really cool, and it was just, yeah, it was a fun experience. But that's basically how that happened. And Kind of a sorry, kind of a long story, but
No, that's great. And I like the you guys weren't all the same. I mean, you guys were all fantasy, but you guys didn't write in the same realm. So like if you wanted like a young adult adventure, you could send them to Dito. If you wanted some kind of romance or slow burn or whatever, you could send them to Ashley or Rachel or Joanne. Like you had so many people there that were helping each other when you were meeting people that when they were asked what do they like to read, like, oh, why don't you go see this person? So
mhm.
I think that's a valuable thing. And I know publishing people have like traditionally published people have done that in the past. Like they've had huge booths where there's multiple different authors, and I like to see the indie scene doing that same thing as well. So that's really cool to see.
Yeah, no, I think it was brilliant, and I don't think like we did advertise that we were indie, but that didn't seem to be the perception, you know. And I think I don't know, I the industry for the longest time has in a way looked down on independently produced media, whether that's music or indie film or indie books. Um, and people are just really looking for good stories, things that
Right.
they want to enjoy, and it was really cool to be there with a bunch of people and to like there's a lot of book people in Utah, and it was also really cool because there were other authors there that weren't part of our group that were also had shared booths, and it was really cool. You ended up meeting a lot of those people too, and it's harkens back to what I said earlier is you know traditionally, or I guess what you said, traditional published authors have done this for a long time, and as an indie, the only difference is I did the coordination rather than having a publisher or an agent or whoever do that coordination.
Right.
Uh, and
And
so
stories are just as good. I've read so many independent and so many traditionally published books that I really couldn't tell the difference on a lot of them. Some of them we can, I admit, but the majority of them, if you want to make a living and be successful at indie publishing, you have to write quality stories where people want to come back and read more.
and that's never changed. It's like that's how it's always been, is to
Yeah,
write something that people are find interesting. And I've also noticed, like, not every book that's ever been written is for me. I don't read a lot of romance. They're not really for me. I don't necessarily like westerns all that much. I've read a few, but I've also kind of learned it's like at least for me, it's like as long as it's not horribly misspelled. Um, like for me, it's like if the story draws my attention, it's like it sucks me in, and it's just a lot of passionate people really wanting to tell stories. And like I said before, I think it's awesome that stories that we might not have been able to see are coming out, and it reminds me of the pulp fiction era from the 1920s through the 50s, because they were short story magazines that were coming out once twice a week, and there were 50 different magazines, and they were just publishing all of this material. And if you go back and read it, not all of it was that good. We have some amazing things that came out of it, like all the Robert E. Howard, Conan stuff. Love that. Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, like a lot of people did really well and made their careers from writing pulp fiction. But it was a way of, I felt like a lot of people were contributing to those stories, and as a way, like digitally, it's like we're kind of doing the same thing. We're getting more stories out there than would have otherwise been possible, and there's just a lot of really great, unique, and cool stuff. And so it's really fun to be a part of that.
that's awesome. Austin, thank you so much for being on with me tonight. Do you have any other tips or tricks that you want to share before we end it?
Um, yeah, I was gonna bring this up earlier, but mean, if anyone's looking for writing advice, one of the best tricks that I've learned is it's called cycling. So what you do is when you're stuck at the blank part of the page, you're not quite sure where to go from there. Cycle back 500 to 1,000 words, and then just kind of read through it and add in details as you go. So maybe you forgot to describe, what the character is wearing, so you just add a little detail there. Maybe you're like, oh, I could probably add this other piece of dialogue, and you're not being critical. You're not writing it as um like, oh, as your editor, not critically trying to tear it apart. You're just creatively adding in details, but you're really just kind of reading where the story is. What I found is most of the time I end up adding some really good details that were missing. And then when I reach that white space, I can plow on for, another page or two, and I know where the story is going to go. Or if I'm stuck and I cycle back and I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm going to have the character do this next decision. Maybe I have to delete a little bit, but that, like, for reaching my, my daily minimum, that trick has been phenomenal for me. So hopefully that's for anyone that's watching that, is wanting to write, that trick is, you know, got more words out of me than any other. So
That's awesome. That's a great tip. Austin, go ahead and tell people how they can get a hold of you or find your website or find your book.
yeah, so you can find my books on my website. So it's austincolton.com. You can also find them on Amazon. So if you just type in my name, my first book is Child of Fire. My second book is Child of Rot. But my author profile page will be on Amazon. You can also contact me on my website. You can sign up for my newsletter, and I really just send announcements for any projects that I'm working on or any events. So I don't send out too much. You can also read free samples of my books on my website, so you can read the prologue for free. Just prologue is a great way of just you get a good taste of what the book is, and there's links there, and I have a free story for download as well.
And I'm just going to say the prologue is amazing. I
Thank
when
you.
I read it, I was like, there's sometimes where you have to, when you're reading a book or starting a new book, like it takes you a little while to, become immersed into it. But with your book, I was immersed immediately. So I will do a plug for that, and I will get your first book and read that. Probably not by 20 books 50K. But if anybody's going to 20 books 50K in Vegas, you said you'd be there.
Yeah, I'll be there. We'll do a lot of those IFA meetups. So if you're an indie fantasy writer, definitely join us there. It was really awesome to meet a bunch of people, and yeah, we just kind of get together every evening after the conference. So that's where I'll be.
Cool. Austin will be there. I will be there. He mentioned some other people that'll be there. So find us. We will hang out. So
Yeah, I'll see you
awesome.
there.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Troy Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share with your friends.